That night, the Italian mafia, in all its glory and power, bent the knee. There was no declared war, no rivers of blood running through the gutters of Manhattan, only a deafening silence emanating from a luxurious suite at the Waldorf Astoria. The story that followed was whispered in reverent tones, a cautionary tale of a fatal error of arrogance, an error that proved that power in New York had a new epicenter, one that answered not to Rome or Sicily, but to the pulsating streets of Harlem. This is the chronicle of how the world's most feared criminal organization was disarmed and humiliated, not by an army, but by the strategic mind of a single man they dared to underestimate. A king who taught them the crucial difference between possessing gold and possessing the soul of a people. Manhattan, 1952. The air in the presidential suite of the Waldorf Astoria was thin, heavy with the smoke of Partagas cigars and the self-assurance of men who considered themselves gods. The Commission, the governing body of the American Cosa Nostra, was in session. Albert Anastasia, whose very presence exuded a contained violence, sat beside Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld, a man whose influence extended from the docks to the highest echelons of the judiciary. They were not there to debate but to ratify a decision. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the undisputed ruler of Harlem, had become more than a nuisance. He was an anomaly that defied the natural order of power as they understood it. His refusal to bow, to pay the tribute they considered rightfully his, was an affront that could no longer be tolerated. The situation was one of predatory clarity. It was time to remove the crown from the Black King's head and reclaim his kingdom. The atmosphere was not one of tension, but of euphoric anticipation. The same felt by hunters when cornering magnificent prey, never considering that the prey could, in fact, be the hunter. The Commission's plan was a symphony of raw power, a demonstration of its full reach. They would activate their most valuable assets within the New York Police Department, initiating an unprecedented crackdown on Harlem's gambling and narcotics operations. Chief Inspector Harrison, a man whose loyalty had been bought and repaid many times over, would lead the charge, ensuring the raids were relentless and crippling. Simultaneously, elite assassin teams would be dispatched to eliminate Bumpy's most trusted lieutenants, decapitating his command structure and sowing chaos. It was a shock and awe strategy, designed not only to dismantle a rival empire, but to make an example of it. The message to anyone who dared challenge the Mafia's hegemony would be clear and brutal. They saw the New York chessboard as their exclusive domain, and Bumpy was an anomalous piece that needed to be swept away so the game could continue under their rules. Victory was considered a formality, the logical conclusion of a power equation where they possessed all the important variables: force, politics, and impunity. Harlem, in the early 1950s, was a world apart, a nation within a city. For white men in Midtown Manhattan, it was a smudge on the map, a place of danger and poverty to be contained. But for its residents, it was the center of the black world, a place of unparalleled cultural energy, where jazz still echoed from club doors and the literature of Langston Hughes and James Baldwin gave voice to a generation. Yet beneath this vibrant cultural layer, economic reality was a daily struggle. Segregation and systemic racism created an ecosystem where the formal economy offered little more than menial jobs and starvation wages. In this vacuum, the underground economy flourished not as a choice, but as a lifeline, a parallel financial institution that was the backbone of the community. The numbers lottery, known as policy, was its main engine, an informal banking system that financed small businesses, paid rents, and ensured that Harlem's money circulated within Harlem, sustaining tens of thousands of people. Bumpy Johnson wasn't merely the head of this economy, he was its architect and guardian. He understood, with a depth his enemies could never fathom, that controlling the lottery meant controlling the economic lifeblood of his community. He wasn't a parasite, but a symbiote. The profits weren't just for his personal enrichment, but were reinvested in countless ways. He was the bank that never denied a loan to a needy family, the philanthropist who distributed turkeys on Thanksgiving, and the protector who ensured the streets were safe for children and the elderly. This relationship transcended that of a crime boss with his subordinates. It was that of a sovereign with his subjects. The loyalty he commanded wasn't bought with fear as in the Mafia, but earned through an unwritten social pact. Every shopkeeper, every shoe-shine boy, every housewife was not just a source of income, but a node in a vast and intricate network of intelligence and mutual support. Attacking Bumpy wasn't attacking a man, it was declaring war on the entire community of Harlem. Bumpy Johnson's mind was a strategic labyrinth, forged in prison through voracious reading of history, philosophy, and above all, the obsessive study of chess. He didn't see the streets of Harlem as territory to be defended with weapons, but as a three-dimensional chessboard where each person was a piece with unique movements and motivations. He was a master of anticipation, thinking 10, 15 moves ahead of his opponents. While his enemies, like the Mafia bosses, thought in terms of force and direct confrontation, Bumpy thought in terms of influence, leverage, and information. He cultivated a public persona of calm and inaccessibility, a man who preferred to be seen playing chess at a table on the sidewalk rather than in a flashy nightclub. This tranquility was his most effective weapon, a mask that hid a mind that was constantly calculating, analyzing, and planning. He understood the power of silence and observation, knowing that the most valuable information was that which people revealed when they believed no one was paying attention. His moral code, though flexible by conventional standards, was absolute within his own realm. Violence was a tool, not a pastime, used with surgical precision and only when necessary. Traitors were punished with a severity that became legendary, but the innocent were fiercely protected. This duality transformed him into an almost mythical figure in Harlem, a guardian angel to the oppressed and a reaper to those who threatened his peace. His reputation was an impenetrable fortress. People feared him, but they also loved him, and more importantly, trusted him. They knew that in a world that treated them as second-class citizens, Bumpy was the only law and the only justice that truly worked in their favor. This deep and widespread loyalty gave him a kind of power that the Mafia, with all its money and political influence, could neither buy nor comprehend. They had informants. Bumpy had a people. This was a distinction that was about to determine the outcome of the approaching war, a war he was already winning before the first shot was even fired. The Commission's fatal mistake was a toxic mix of institutional arrogance and racial bias. They saw themselves as the pinnacle of organized crime evolution, a sophisticated corporate structure. In their worldview, Bumpy Johnson was a primitive, a talented but fundamentally inferior tribal chief ruling over a disorganized people. The idea that his power network could rival theirs was laughable. They underestimated the cohesion and loyalty of the Harlem community, seeing its inhabitants not as citizens of a rival kingdom, but as mere civilians, invisible and insignificant. This blindness led them to commit the cardinal sin of war, lack of discretion. In their lavish meetings, surrounded by waiters and staff whom they considered part of the furniture, they spoke openly, plotting their plans for the subjugation of Harlem with the confidence of generals planning a battle against an army of peasants. They couldn't fathom that the young man refilling their whiskey glasses was the nephew of one of Bumpy's men, or that the chambermaid cleaning the suite owed a debt of gratitude to the man they intended to destroy. This arrogance crystallized into their absolute trust in Inspector Harrison. To the Commission, he was an asset, a tool bought and paid for. They gave him orders, expecting blind obedience. What they didn't realize was that Harrison's greed made him vulnerable, and Bumpy was a master at exploiting vulnerabilities. While the Mafia saw Harrison as their man in the police force, Bumpy saw him as a weak link, a gateway into the inner workings of their enemies' plans. The mistake wasn't just trusting a corrupt man, but underestimating their opponent's capacity to corrupt them even further. The Commission operated under the assumption that their power and money were absolute, that their influence was unquestionable. They moved with the predictability of an avalanche, noisy and destructive, never looking up to see who might be at the top of the mountain, ready to unleash an even bigger rockslide. They were playing checkers with straightforward and obvious moves, while Bumpy was playing a three-dimensional game of chess on a scale they couldn't even imagine. The trap was set not with steel and gunpowder, but with patience and psychology. When the police raids began, Bumpy didn't retaliate. He retreated. He allowed some of his playing fields to be shut down, some of his lower-level men to be arrested. He projected an image of weakness, of a retreating king absorbing the blows and appearing incapable of fighting back. To the Commission, observing from afar, this confirmed all their assumptions. They saw Bumpy's retreat as the beginning of his disintegration, proof that his shock-and-awe strategy was working perfectly. The tension in Harlem was real, but it was an orchestrated tension, the tense silence of an orchestra waiting for the conductor's command. Every police move, every arrest, was carefully monitored and controlled by Bumpy through his own network of contacts within the department, including Inspector Harrison himself, who was now playing both sides, providing information to Bumpy in exchange for the promise of a reward far greater than the Mafia could ever offer. The setting for the checkmate was chosen with masterful irony, the same presidential suite at the Waldorf Astoria where war had been declared. After weeks of feigning weakness, Bumpy sent an emissary to Frank Costello, requesting a meeting to discuss the terms of a peaceful transition. The bait was irresistible. The committee, exultant in its apparent victory, agreed immediately, imagining a defeated Bumpy coming to kiss the ring and beg for a peaceful retirement. They gathered, the same men in the same room, the air thick with the scent of triumph. They expected a supplicant, a broken man ready to hand over the keys to his kingdom. Instead, at the appointed time, the door opened and Bumpy Johnson entered. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his posture erect, his face a mask of unnerving calm. He carried no weapons, only a thin leather briefcase in one hand. The trap was not an ambush in the hallway. Contained within that folder was a collection of truths that were about to shatter their world. The turning point was one of theatrical stillness. Frank Costello, in his role as the magnanimous conqueror, began to speak, his condescending voice outlining the terms of Bumpy's surrender. He spoke of the territories to be ceded, the payments to be made, the manner in which Bumpy would quietly fade into obscurity. Bumpy listened without interruption, a slight, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. When Costello finally finished his monologue, an expectant silence hung in the room. It was then that Bumpy leaned forward, opened his briefcase and began to lay its contents out on the polished mahogany table. They were not surrender contracts. They were photographs, accounting notebooks, and a small roll of audio tape. The air in the room shifted instantly, confidence evaporating like mist under the morning sun. The hunters realized too late that the cage door had closed behind them, and the man they thought was the prey was, in fact, the master of the hunt. Each item Bumpy placed on the table was a bullet aimed at the heart of one of the men present. For Costello, there were accounting books detailing a tax evasion scheme so complex it would land him in prison for life. For Anastasia, explicit photographs of him with the wife of a federal judge, an indiscretion that would destroy his reputation and power. For Joe Bonanno, documents proving he was plotting to usurp Costello's power. And finally, the coup de grace. Bumpy calmly placed a small recorder on the table and pressed play. Costello's voice echoed in the silent room, captured from one of their secret meetings, describing in disparaging detail his plans to deceive his own partners. The face of each man in the room shifted from arrogance to shock, and from shock to a pale, utter terror. In that instant, Bumpy Johnson took complete control. He hadn't raised his voice or made a single threat. He simply revealed that he knew their darkest secrets, that his omniscience was absolute. Power not only changed hands, it became concentrated in a single point, at the tips of Bumpy's fingers. The immediate consequence of the Mafia's mistake was an unconditional and humiliating capitulation. The most powerful men in New York, who moments before had been dictating the terms of Bumpy's annihilation, were now silent, completely at his mercy. He held in his hands the power to destroy not only their empires, but their lives, their families, and to plunge the Cosa Nostra into a bloody internal war from which it might never recover. It was a strategic annihilation, far more devastating than any physical violence. It was then that Bumpy, in the same calm and controlled voice, dictated his true terms. First, the Commission would withdraw from Harlem immediately and permanently. All attempts at incursion would cease. Harlem was his sovereign territory. Second, They would pay a war tax, an astronomical sum, as reparation for their transgression. Third, Chief Inspector Harrison would be publicly dishonored and removed. There was no negotiation. The bosses, with grey faces, simply nodded. It was a symbolic kneeling, but its resonance was as real as if they had physically prostrated themselves on the floor of that luxury suite. The strategic consequence was even more profound. By neutralizing the commission and exposing its internal vulnerabilities, Bumpy not only secured his autonomy, but also became a power broker on a whole new scale. He now possessed blackmail material on the most powerful men in the underworld, giving him unprecedented leverage. He could influence mafia decisions, mediate disputes, and ensure his interests were always protected. He transformed an attempt at destruction into a reverse acquisition of power. Bumpy's men who had been arrested were quietly released in the following days, the charges mysteriously dropped. The police presence in Harlem evaporated overnight. The war the Mafia had started ended with them not only losing but becoming, in a sense, reluctant vassals of the king they had tried to dethrone. Bumpy didn't just win the battle, he rewrote the rules of the game and redefined the power map in New York for the next decade. To seal his victory and etch the message into the fabric of the underworld, Bumpy orchestrated a final public spectacle. The tax money paid by the Mafia didn't disappear into his pockets. Instead, an anonymous donation of epic proportions was made to fund the construction of a new hospital and community center in the heart of Harlem. The origin of the money was an open secret, a public demonstration that the aggression against Harlem had been transformed into prosperity for Harlem. Inspector Harrison was suddenly exposed in a newspaper corruption scandal, his ties to the Mafia revealed by an anonymous leak, ending his career in disgrace. The message was crystal clear and brutally effective. Justice in Harlem was inevitable, and it wasn't just punitive, it was restorative. Bumpy Johnson didn't need monuments for himself. The hospital became his monument. The most striking symbol, however, was Bumpy's own normalcy. In the days following this seismic shift in power, he wasn't seen celebrating in clubs or flaunting his newfound influence. He was seen in his usual spot, at a chess table on the sidewalk of 125th Street, playing games with the neighborhood kids, greeting neighbors with a nod and an enigmatic smile. His calmness was the ultimate declaration of power. It was the confidence of a man who didn't need to prove he was king, because everyone around him, from the shoeshine boy on the corner to the terrified bosses downtown, now knew it as an undeniable truth. His quiet presence on the streets of his kingdom was a constant reminder that the deepest power is the one that doesn't need to be proclaimed, for it is simply felt like gravity or the passage of time. He had turned his legend into a fact. The historical impact of Kneeling Day was immense and lasting. It established, once and for all, Harlem's sovereignty as a kingdom within a kingdom. Never again would the Italian Mafia attempt a direct power grab. They were forced into a tense coexistence, treating Bumpy not as a rival, but as a foreign head of state. This forced truce gave Bumpy the freedom to expand his legitimate businesses and increase his influence as a political figure and civil rights activist, albeit in an unconventional way. He became an intermediary between the white world of power and the black masses of Harlem, a man who could navigate both worlds, but whose ultimate loyalty was never in doubt. He ensured that, for at least another generation, the economic and social fate of Harlem would be determined by those who lived there, not by absentee masters. For the people of Harlem, the story became a modern epic, a David and Goliath tale that reaffirmed their sense of pride and power in a time of overwhelming oppression. It was proof that they had a champion, a brilliant strategist who could confront the most powerful organization in the country and defeat it on its own terms, using intelligence as his only weapon. Bumpy's victory was not just a personal victory, it was a symbolic victory for the community, an act of resistance that resonated far beyond the borders of the underworld. That silent confrontation in a luxury hotel suite not only saved a criminal empire, it helped preserve the autonomy of a culture and the dignity of a people, leaving a complex and indelible legacy in American history. The saga of Bumpy Johnson and the capitulation of the Mafia serves as a timeless chronicle of the true nature of power. It teaches that brute force and arrogance are ultimately passive, and that true domination is achieved through knowledge, strategy, and a deep understanding of human psychology. Bumpy didn't rule a territory, he led a people. This distinction was his greatest asset and the fatal mistake of his enemies. The lessons of his reign, the importance of information, the power of loyalty, and the effectiveness of strategic patience are as relevant today as they were on the shadowy streets of Harlem in the 1950s. If the analysis of the intricate architectures of power and the hidden histories that shape our world fascinates you, know that every historical figure, every event, is a chessboard waiting to be studied, and the most brilliant moves are those that remain invisible to most.